Mr. Height here. This is something new I'm starting. I realized that I was repeating myself in my 10th grade and my ninth grade videos about what we're doing in the classroom when it came to poetry, because I do them in both classes. I do the same poems in both classes. So I thought that what I would do is separate out and create a video just for the poems I use each week. And I'm only doing 2 poems a week, Mondays and Tuesdays, during our cafe days. So I thought what I would do is start a little bit here and talk about why I use poetry. I don't use poetry because I want my students to love poetry. If that happens, I couldn't be happier. I don't even use poetry because I want my students obviously to become poets. Again, if that happens, I'd probably be overjoyed with such a thing. But I use poetry when it comes to starting the week off in English class, because what I want my students to do is pay attention to language. And for me, the way I approach poems is at the level of language. And I can credit a whole lot of people with this. But the main person I would credit for my focus on language instead of just a focus on meaning is Kenneth Koch. This book, Sleeping on the Wing, several other books that he has written, including Rose, Where Did You Get That Red? Wishes, Lies, Hopes, and Dreams. And another book called I Never Told Anybody, which is all about teaching great poetry to people who may never have experienced it before. And you don't teach it by trying to delve into what is the mystery of the universe that is being unveiled to you here in this poem, because that's just ridiculous. You teach it at the level of language. You teach it as playing with language, which is what Bill Moyers' book by Bill Moyers about the Geraldine R. Dodge Poetry Festival, he once called it playing with language, or fooling with language, I think. Another reason I use poetry is because for me, the way I grew up and how I came to poetry, poetry for me is like an aesthetic. It is a way of existing in the world and realizing that there are so many things that we can ask questions about and so many mysteries. And poetry, because it is another language written in English, is mysterious maybe in and of itself, but even better, I like to think that poetry is like a spell. If you go all the way back to some of the earliest poems, obviously they would be incantatory in nature. They would rhyme, they would have rhythm, obviously. And there's no, I think, mistake and no accident that when you listen to magic spells, they often rhyme as well, because the words are doing things to us. We know this. And it's at the level of words and what they do to us that really excites me. And so from an aesthetic, from a point of like how I exist in the world, poetry has always let me into asking questions about things and asking why is it the way it is. So there's a whole lot more there, but right now, this week's poems, there are 2. I'm going to read both of them and talk about how I use them in class. So the first poem this week was a poem called Forgetfulness by Billy Collins. I chose this because in my 9th grade, we're going to be starting a small writing assignment, a reflective essay or personal essay, and that is actually based on This I Believe, which is an old radio program. And for that, students need to delve into their memories and pull out a really meaningful event to them and how that caused them to come to a different belief about themselves and in the world. So I thought what I would do is start by talking about memory, because I am fascinated with memory. We talk about memory a lot in my class, especially in 9th and 10th grade gifted classes. We talk about memory and how memory creates identity in the self. So this poem by Billy Collins is interesting because it's not about memory so much as it is about forgetting things. This is Forgetfulness by Billy Collins, links down bottom. Forgetfulness. The name of the author is the first to go, followed obediently by the title, the plot, the heartbreaking conclusion, the entire novel, which suddenly becomes one you've never read, never even heard of. As if, one by one, the memories you used to harbor, decided to retire to the southern hemisphere of the brain, to a little fishing village where there are no phones. Long ago, you kissed the name of the 9 muses goodbye and watched the quadratic equation pack its bag. And even now, as you memorize the order of the planets, something else is slipping away. A state flower, perhaps, the address of an uncle, the capital of Paraguay. Whatever it is you are struggling to remember, it is not poised on the tip of your tongue or even lurking in some obscure corner of your spleen. It has floated away down a dark mythological river whose name begins with an L, as far as you can recall. Well on your own way to oblivion, where you will join those who have even forgotten how to swim and how to ride a bicycle. No wonder you rise in the middle of the night to look up the date of a famous battle in a book on war. No wonder the moon in the window seems to have drifted out of a love poem that you used to know by heart. So for this poem, what I had the students do is sort of think about something I once heard a neuroscientist say. He was describing the brain and how it acts and what it does, and he sort of flipped perspective and he said, the brain isn't so much a remembering organ as it is a forgetting organ. Because if it were a remembering organ, we would remember everything, and that would debilitate us. So the brain is actually very active in choosing what not to remember, which is kind of interesting because if the brain is doing choosing and you are not, there's something else at play there, but that's for a different time. So I had the students answer this question. Does thinking of the brain as a forgetting organ elevate memory to a more precious state, or does it sort of decline and memory falls sort of into a biological hanger-on of sorts? I did that because I want them to think about memory and how it works as we progress towards this, I believe. The second poem that I chose is called Early Memory, and it is by January Gill O'Neil. Early Memory. I remember picking up a fistful of sand, smooth crystals, like hourglass sand, and throwing it into the eyes of a boy. Johnny or Danny or Kevin, he was not important. I was 5, and I knew he would cry. I remember everything about it. The sandbox in the corner of the room at Cinderella Daycare. Ms. Lee, who ran over after the boy wailed for his mother, her stern look as the words, "No snack," formed on her lips. My hands, with their gritty, half-mooned fingernails, I hid in the pockets of my blue and white dress. How she found them and uncurled small, sandy fists. There must have been such rage in me to give such pain to another person. This afternoon, I saw a man pull a gold chain off the neck of a woman as she crossed the street. She cried out with a sound that bleached me. I walked on, unable to help, knowing that fire in childhood clenched deep in my pockets all the way home. So for this poem, what I did was I asked them to focus simply on a verb in the poem. And this is because one of the ways that I want them to think about their writing and revising their writing is by really focusing on the most powerful word in anything they write, and that is the verb. So I asked them to focus on a verb, to choose that verb, and then to write very simply about why they chose that verb, what it was about that word that sang out to them from the paper. And so that got us into talking about verbs and how powerful they are, but early memory as a poem itself is going to come back because it's going to be the touchstone I use when I start to ask them to think about the things they need to start remembering for their This I Believe work this week. So that's how I used poem this week. Tune in next week for another poetry. I'm going to find a word for it. I don't know yet, but it's going to get into next week's poem.